Okay, Chapter 16, The Conquest of the Far West. In this chapter, we're going to look at the transformation of the American West. We'll begin by looking at the different groups that inhabit the West, then document the spread of white settlers into the area. Specifically, we'll be looking at the conflict with the Native Americans. So some big ideas I want you to kind of keep in the back of your mind as you're reading through this chapter and reading through this PowerPoint. We're going to talk about the population groups of the West. We'll talk about the economic impact of the West on the United States. And then lastly, we will close out with the subjugation of the Plains Indians. All right, so let's talk about the population groups out west. The first person I want to introduce you to is an American historian by the name of Frederick Jackson Turner. Frederick Jackson Turner is famous for his so-called frontier thesis. Now, a thesis is a big idea, right? So Frederick Jackson Turner had this big idea about the American West, and this is what he said. He says, the settlement of the West had transformed a desolate and savage land into modern civilization and renewed Americans' ideas about democracy and individualism. Now, let's think about this for a second. The settlement of the West had transformed a desolate and savage land and renewed America's spirit. To a certain extent, this is true. The West has always represented opportunity to America, even before we moved past the Mississippi River, even before there's a United States, even back when we were still colonies of Great Britain. People always had this drive to push out west because the West was opportunity. It's more land, it's a clean slate, it's a new beginning. And eventually these feelings will, people will start referring to this as manifest destiny, this idea that the American people were handpicked by God, that we were the new chosen people, and it was our duty almost to spread our culture and our government as far west as we possibly could. So to a certain extent, this idea that moving out west and our experiences out west helped transform America, yes, that is probably true to a certain extent. However, was it a desolate and savage land? Well, first of all, it's hard to categorize the West as one land because the land out west is not a single area. You have the Great Plains, you have the Rocky Mountains, you have desert, you have valleys. In fact, the far west is a very diverse land. You have both the driest and the wettest places in the United States. You have the flattest plains. You have the highest mountains. You have huge prairies and huge forests. So, saying that this was an empty and savage and desolate land is a little hard to make that broad generalization. And of course, is the land truly empty? No, it's not. There are tens of thousands of people, maybe even hundreds of thousands of people living out west. By far, the largest population group before American settlers began to move out west were the Native Americans. We don't have exact numbers on how many Native Americans. They didn't keep population records themselves. Estimates anywhere from before Europeans arrived in the New World, 300,000 to 400,000 Native Americans lived out west. And of course, as we all know, due to violence, due to disease, huge numbers of Native Americans died. But even then, even by the time we're talking about the mid-1800s, there's probably still at least 150 to 200,000 Native Americans living out west. Some of these groups are people that have lived there forever, maybe the Navajo or the Pueblo, and some of these Native American groups are groups that have been forcibly relocated from out east. For example, maybe the Cherokee, the Creek, once lived further east, but they had been removed by the United States government, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So we've got all these different groups of people, all these different tribes, and again, you should realize that the distinction of a tribe is largely an American invention. These Native Americans did not necessarily, categorize themselves as nicely and neatly as Americans did into these different tribes. But all these different groups of people, all these different tribes, plus um, years and years of interactions with the Spanish, who of course owned the American West before America did, has created a very complex social hierarchy. So before Americans even really began pushing out west, there's already a very complex civilization out west. And depending really upon your birth, your tribe, and where you live determined where you fit into that social ladder. Remember, society is a ladder. There are groups on top, there are groups in the middle, and there are groups on bottom. That's what a hierarchy is. And so there's already a very complex social hierarchy in place before American settlers began pushing further out west. Now, the largest group of Native Americans out west will be the Plains Indians. Now, these different groups, they have different ways of life, different languages, but there are some constants. It's a culture based on close and extended family networks and an intimate relationship with nature. The tribes usually lived in bands of around 500 people, each of which would have its own rudimentary government, its own governing council. Jobs were divided along gender lines. Religion was based in the natural world. And these groups are highly independent. That is something that is crucial and critical to remember, because that will be the great downfall of the Native Americans, is that they could not unite together. If the Native Americans, if all the different tribes, if all the different groups and bands had managed to unite together to provide a united resistance against American settlers, it could have been a very different story. But they were unable to do so. They were fiercely independent groups, and that would be eventually one of their greatest downfalls. This is the sort of stereotypical image of a Plains Indian. You can see riding a horse, carrying a rifle. You see another Native American in the background. Very mobile people. Most of these Plains Indians were at least semi-nomadic, if not outright nomads. They moved around place to place. And of course, the reason for that is many Plains Indians lived by hunting buffalo, and the buffalo formed the economic basis of their lives. They ate it for food, they used it for clothing, for housing, for utensils, for fuel, for weapons, everything. And so as the buffalo moved around the plains, so did the Indian groups that followed it. So at the very least, they were semi-nomadic. Groups like the Cheyenne, the Comanche, the Crow, the Apache. These are the larger groups of Plain Indians. We also have large numbers of Hispanic Americans, and these are holdovers from the old Spanish Empire. The far west had been part of the Spanish Empire and Mexico after that for centuries before Americans began to migrate. And many Mexicans still lived there when America acquired it after the Mexican-American War. So virtually overnight, they went from citizens of the Mexican Empire to citizens of the American government. Sometimes Native Americans and Hispanic Americans would ally together because they found themselves having a common foe, and that is the white settlers, of course, because again, Hispanic Americans and Native Americans have formed this very complex social ladder. And here comes the white Americans, the settlers, who want to disrupt that. They want to disrupt essentially what has been centuries of building a society. And so they both found themselves at odds against American settlers, and so sometimes they would make allies of each other. By far, the largest immigrant group out west will be the Chinese. Chinese immigrants came in through what is modern-day California, and they came out west to work. And initially, Chinese immigrants were very welcomed in the United States because they represented cheap labor, especially on the railroads. You can't really see here, it's all covered in snow, which should also give you some idea as to the working conditions of these Chinese immigrants. They were not good, but they were very welcomed as cheap labor on the railroad companies as they expanded out west. Initially, very welcomed. However, as time goes on, as more and more Chinese immigrants arrive in the United States, it's the same story that you can see happening today. The fear was that they would steal jobs from Americans, feelings turned hostile, and feelings of nativism began to set in. And in fact, this would culminate in probably one of the most restrictive laws America has ever passed. It was known as the Chinese Exclusion Act. Congress passed a law in 1882 saying that no more Chinese immigrants were allowed into the United States. Initially, the ban was for 10 years. Later, it was made permanent. So Congress sat down and said no more people of Chinese descent can move to the United States ever. As far as I know, this is the first and only time the U.S. government has set down immigration quotas on race. Not necessarily saying people from China, they were saying people of Chinese descent. So, as you can see, feelings against Chinese immigrants, they were already treated pretty badly. As you can tell from those working conditions, they represented cheap labor, and American companies didn't really worry about how they were treating their Chinese workers. So they were already treated fairly badly, but this just takes it one step further, the Chinese Exclusion Act. All right, let's talk about the transformation of the West, because Western migration, it really begins before the American Civil War, but especially after the Civil War, it will explode. And the reason for that, especially after the Civil War, was the direct stake that the federal government had in transforming the West, the direct hand that the federal government, the active role it took in moving people out west, in signing treaties with Native American groups out west, with selling land out west, with conducting wars out west. The federal government really gets involved after the Civil War in an attempt to get people to move out west. All right, the first big economic boom that gets people moving out west is going to be mining. Gold and silver strikes were the reason that many people moved out west in the first place. And of course, their hope was you move out west, you strike the mother lode, you get rich, and then you can move back east and take that money, your fortune, and live the easy life. So I want you people to realize that a lot of the people that moved out west in the first place had no intention of staying there permanently. The idea was you come out west for a year or two, you get rich quick, and then you go back east where you can enjoy your fortune and live the easy life off of the gold and silver that you had discovered. And of course, most people don't strike it rich. Most people move out west, and they're forced to stay out west because they move out west, they give up everything back east, and then they don't have any money. Now, gold and silver definitely generate the most excitement, but in the long run, we actually make the most money off of these industrial metals, things like copper and lead and tin and quartz and zinc. And so what actually happened was people flocked out west to make their riches and get rich quick. And then once they don't get rich quick, they have to find a job. And so a lot of these former prospectors will go to work in the large industrial mines. These mines are incredibly dangerous and they don't pay very much. So a lot of people saw the West as a quick and easy road to fortune, and it turns out that they made a very hard life for themselves in the process. Of course, sometimes people do strike it rich, and whenever that happened, what were known as boomtowns were formed. Literally overnight, people would raise towns up. You would have maybe 2 or 3 saloons. You might have a church. You'd probably have some sort of general store and maybe 2 or 3 hotels. And these buildings would be thrown together over a matter of days. There would be no government. There would be no law and order. High incidence of crime, violence, prostitution. The wild, wild west, it actually was for some people. This boomtown lifestyle, very, very rough. And in fact, it's the growing boomtowns that will eventually lead the United States to take a more active role in the West. They realized the chaos that was happening out West and the need for a stable government. And so that will push the government to say, okay, we need to do something. We need to get organized. We need to set down laws out West. Okay. The second great boom is going to be agriculture, farming, and especially the raising of cattle. People flooded into the West. And again, as I said, the federal government greatly aided that. For example, they passed the Homestead Act of 1862. The federal government said, we will give you essentially for free. There were a few fees associated with it, but they essentially said, we will give you for free 160 acres of land. And all you have to do is promise to live on it for 5 years. You live on it, you plant some crops, you put up some buildings, you put up some fences. If you live on the land and improve it for 5 years, you will get 160 acres land for free. Now, if you're living out east and there's no land left, remember, people have been living in the east since the 1600s. The land's already been divided up, right? There's no more land just for the taking. And so if you're living out east and you're thinking to yourself, I can't get a leg up, I can't get started in life because there's no land, and you see that they're offering land for free and substantial land. 160 acres isn't anything to sneeze at. They're offering substantial land for free out west. That's going to turn a lot of heads. And of course, as more people move out, as land becomes easier to reach by way of the railroads as they expand, and of course, as the railroads expand, it's easier to move people out west, but it's also easier to move farm products back east. So once you grow the wheat, once you grow the corn, once you raise the cattle, the railroads enabled you to ship it back east so you could get paid for it. So as the railroads expanded out west, so did the people. The railroads were the interstates of the 1800s, right? That was the main way that people and goods moved around the United States. And it was incredibly successful. The land out west is incredibly rich and fertile, and the West becomes an international breadbasket. Not only are we growing enough food to feed Americans, we're now growing enough food that we can begin shipping it out of the country. Now, something I do want to point out. When people think of people moving out west, a lot of us have in our minds this idea of the prairie family, right? Of the frontier family, of the little house on the prairie even, right? Where people were self-sufficient. That is, they grew their own food, they sewed their own clothes, they baked their own soap, whatever. These families were so remote and isolated. In order to come up with the things they needed for daily life, they had to produce those things themselves. And okay, that's true. There certainly is a lot of that going on. But I also want you to know that a lot of these farms are commercial farms. They're not subsistence farms. The people aren't growing food for them to eat. Now, they probably had a garden where they grew a few potatoes and maybe some tomatoes and maybe some corn. But they're 160 acres. They're not growing food for them to eat on that land. They're devoting 150 acres to wheat. They're devoting 150 acres to corn, right? They're growing a single specialized crop that they will sell at market. Now, as time goes on, that becomes more and more prevalent. And eventually, today, we have what are known as bonanza farms, where farms aren't 100 acres or 200 acres. They're 1,000 acre or 5,000 acres. There are these huge farms that concentrate on a single specialized crop. And again, they're not growing that crop to eat. They're not growing 160 or 1,600 acres of wheat to eat themselves. They're growing to sell that on the market. And instead of cooking their own soap, they're going to use that money they get and buy soap. They're not sewing their own clothes. They're using that money they get and buying their own clothes. So yeah, and probably more so in the beginning than later on, there are these frontier families that have to depend on themselves and they have to produce everything they need. But especially as time goes on, especially as we hit the 1880s and beyond, that frontier lifestyle really kind of falls out of favor for this more specialized, commercialized agriculture. And of course, this is the golden age of the cattle kingdom. And really, it's kind of an interesting story. The reason that we see the growth of the cattle kingdom and eventually even the demise of the cattle kingdom will be because of railroads. The cattle kingdom, the golden age of cattle, ranchers raised their cattle out west in what was known as the open range. It was land that was open for the taking. Nobody owned it, and so any farmer or rancher, I should say, could raise their cattle out west for free, essentially. And so they would take their cattle out west, they would raise them, they would winter them there, and then they would begin what were known as the long drives, right? They would hire cowboys to herd their cattle back to the east, places like St. Louis and Chicago, where the cattle could then be slaughtered and then the meat shipped further back east. Well, what allowed them to do that were the railroads, because you have to have railroads between St. Louis and Chicago and back further east. You have to have railroad depots where you can drive your cattle to have them slaughtered to ship the meat quickly enough back east so that it would still be good. So railroads are what first allowed cattle ranchers to utilize the open range. However, as railroads grew, so did the towns that sprang up beside them. I said earlier that railroads are kind of like the interstates of the Old West, and that's true. And it's the exact same thing today. Anytime they build an interstate through a new area, what do you see pop up along the off-ramps? You see gas stations and some fast food restaurants, maybe a hotel or two, and eventually that might grow into its own little town. Same thing happened with the railroads. As the railroad lines are being laid further out west, little towns sprang up alongside them. More people moved out west. And as more people moved out west, they began to fence in the land. Joseph Glidden and I.L. Elwood patented an invention that would revolutionize Western life. And of course, that invention is barbed wire. With barbed wire, it became quicker and easier for people to put up fencing around what they regarded as their own land. And so as more people moved out west and more land began to be fenced in, the open range where ranchers could raise their cattle for free shrank. And that led to conflict between the town people and the ranchers, and even violence would come about because of this. So the cattle kingdom by the early 1900s, especially the golden age of the cattle kingdom was over, but there for a short while, the cowboys reigned supreme. And even today, most Americans have this vision of a cowboy in their mind. It's this very romantic image. And I don't mean romantic as in love. I mean romantic as in idealized. The cowboy has always represented, that streak of American independence that we pride ourselves on, that the cowboy doesn't need anybody else. He can pull himself up by his own bootstrap. He represents true American freedom. He represents true American independence. And, there's some truth to that. But the reality is, very few people became cowboys because they wanted to be cowboys. Yes, they were independent, because they had no support system. They were out west on the long drives and they didn't have any help. And if something went wrong, they had to fix it themselves or suffer the consequences. So the life of a cowboy was a very difficult life. They didn't get paid very much money. And usually most of the people that were cowboys did that because they didn't have any other option. So while we have this idealized and romanticized view of cowboys in American culture, please know that that was not always the reality. In fact, it was rarely the reality. All right, subjugation of the Plains Indians. And of course, the more people that moved out west, the more contact that Indians and settlers had with each other, more conflict, and eventually open warfare will occur between the Native Americans and the white settlers. So this settlement of the West is going to spell doom for the Native Americans. The first policy the American government undertook with regards to Native American relocation was known as relocation. And the idea was America would get the land between the Mississippi River and the Atlantic Ocean, and then Native Americans could have everything beyond the Mississippi River. So if you were already living beyond the Mississippi River, you were okay. If not, if you were one of the groups that lived back east, they were forcibly relocated. So that was the idea. As long as they gave up in their land in the east, they could have all the land they wanted to past the Mississippi River. Of course, as America continues to grow and more people are being born and more immigrants move to the United States, we needed more land. The land between the Mississippi and the Atlantic Ocean, it was all divvied up and people want more land. So they began looking across the Mississippi as new open lands for settlement. And that is what gave rise to the second policy adopted by the American government, which was known as concentration. Instead of one big area for everyone to live in, the West, each group was given its own little slice of land to live on. And of course, these are known as reservations. And so the Indians were literally concentrated. They were all piled onto these smaller plots of land that the government said, okay, these 1,000 acres belong to the Cherokee now, and these 2,000 acres belong to the Creek now, and that's where you're going to live. You don't have all the West that you can roam around in. You now have these defined plots of land, these reservations, lands that have been reserved only for Native American use. Now, this really accomplishes two goals for the American government. Number one, it separates the tribes and makes it harder for them to unify. And number two, it assures that their settlers get the best land, because you can be certain as the government is drawing up these reservations, they're not giving the best land to the Native Americans. They are saving that for the white settlers. Now, prior to the Civil War, Native Americans are rarely, if ever, hostile. As we move into the 1850s and beyond the Civil War, though, that is going to change. And from the 1850s through the 1880s, Native Americans and white Americans are going to fight a series of what are essentially wars, known as the Indian Wars. Now, we're not going to go through every single incident in the Indian Wars, but I just want to hit a couple of the highlights here. Between 1850 and 1880, at least 5,000 Indians were killed by settlers, not by the army, but just by the settlers. Okay, for example, the Sand Creek Massacre happens in 1864. What had happened was there were tensions between the white settlers and local Native Americans, and the army was going to counterattack. And so what the governor of Colorado, this happens in Colorado, the governor of Colorado says, hey, if you're a friendly Native American, you need to come into these army forts for protection, because we're about to launch a counterattack and we don't want to attack someone who's friendly. And so a band of Arapaho and Cheyenne Indians take shelter at Fort Lyon, mostly women and children. What happened was they were making no hostile intentions. There were no acts of violence. Some members of the band were warriors, but like I said, most were women and children. Uh, an army officer by the name of Colonel Chivington led a volunteer militia force. So they weren't even regular army soldiers. They were just a group of settlers. Led them to the Indians' encampment. There were hostilities. Things were said. 133 people died as a result of this conflict. 105 of them women and children. After the Civil War, the American government began, the Army itself got more involved. For example, the Battle of Little Bighorn. Probably the fiercest warriors of the Plains Indians were the Sioux. And so what happens in 1867, the Sioux unite under two of their chiefs, Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, and they meet the 7th Cavalry led by Colonel Custer. What happened was the Sioux had left their reservation, and the 7th Cavalry was dispatched to send them back to the reservation. Well, Colonel Custer did not realize what he was marching into, and he met the Sioux at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, which was the largest Indian victory of that time. They destroyed the 7th Cavalry. Colonel Custer and 264 members of the cavalry were ambushed and killed. And so there are victories for the Native Americans, but not very many of them. For example, in 1887, the Nez Perce tribe, a small tribe that lived in Oregon. They lived in Oregon for quite some time. They had never signed a treaty. Eventually, the government decided it was going to move them to a reservation, I believe in Idaho, and so sent settlers and an army group to forcibly move them. Well, during the journey, there were hostilities, and 4 white settlers ended up dying. Now, their chief Joseph, who's pictured here, realized what was about to happen to his people, and so he decided to make a run for it. He thought if they could get to Canada, they could escape the American government and the retribution they thought was coming. So Chief Joseph took around 500 of his people and fled to Canada. And unfortunately, he didn't make it. They were caught just short of the border. And this is the speech that Chief Joseph gave after he and his people were captured. Very, very famous speech. He's essentially giving in. My heart is sick and sad from where the sun now stands. I will fight no more forever. He felt there was nothing else he could do. The last resistance to the white settlers, the Chiricahua Apaches, led by Magnus Coloradus and Cochise, and later Cochise's successor Geronimo. After the Apache were defeated, that was the end of the formalized Indian Wars, but that's not the end of the violence. In the 1890s, the Sioux were experiencing a religious revival known as the Ghost Dance. And one of the things that the Ghost Dance taught, it was kind of a prophecy, right? It foretold of a world in which the white settlers no longer threatened Native Americans and they could have all their land back. And so a lot of white settlers felt that that was going to incite a rebellion. Later on, at Wounded Knee, the 7th Cavalry rounded up around 350 starving Indians. Fighting broke out. 40 soldiers were killed. 200 Indians died. And so by the time that the 1800s end, the Indians, their spirit was well and truly broken. They couldn't unite with one another. And as a matter of fact, not only would they not unite to stand up against the white settlers, they would actively fight against one another. And sometimes the United States and white settlers used that to their advantage. They would temporarily ally with one Native American group to fight a separate Native American group that they played both ends against the middle. And of course, the always the ever-present fear of disease killed numerous Native Americans. The American government also practiced economic warfare. As I mentioned, the buffalo was the basis of life for many of these Plains Indians groups that provided the most resistance. And so the government would put out contracts to slaughter the buffalo. And you can see here, if you can't tell from this picture, that's a hill, that's a giant mound of buffalo skulls. They slaughtered thousands, tens of thousands of buffalo all across the Great Plains, almost to the point of extinction. Buffalo are just now today beginning to come back in numbers to move them off of the endangered species list. So the idea was, if we take away their basis of life, they won't be able to survive. And even beyond that, it wasn't enough to militarily defeat the Native Americans. They wanted to systematically change their culture. And probably the best example of this is what's known as the Dawes Act. One of the things the Dawes Act did, it began to break up the reservations. But one of the major parts of it was it removed Native American children from their families and placed them into boarding schools. And the idea was, if they were removed from that culture and placed into boarding schools, they could learn to live like white society. And you can see here examples of this. These are the three same boys. The picture is entitled Three Lakota Boys from the Carlisle Indian Industrial School circa 1900. And you can see in the first picture, they're dressed in their native dress, and in the second picture, they're dressed as if they belonged in white society, which at that point they probably did. They were brainwashing them, right? The idea was, if they could destroy that culture, if they could remove them from that culture and teach them to live like white people, then that would destroy the Native American culture. And you can see it, and it's not just their clothes, it's not just their haircuts, even their posture, the way that they hold themselves, the language that they use. They were taught to speak English instead of their native language. It was sadly all too effective at eradicating Native American culture. And the sad fact of it is, most Native Americans felt pressured to assimilate, to learn to live like white people. As a matter of fact, some Native Americans weren't even regarded as full citizens until 1924. So